There we go. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, there we go. Yeah, much better.
Yeah,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
Just transferred to my Tesla. My dad said call it from Tesla Studios.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess in one sense that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, it's kind of nice. I'm inside the Tesla and it's the studio, and I got my camera rigged up to where it's hanging off my mirror, and so it's closer to me now. It's a little better visual, and yeah.
Very good.
So here we
Wow.
go. Yeah. Um don't know if you had a minute to do a quick podcast, but
Yeah,
what's your
yeah.
timing?
No, this is a good time. What did you want to talk about?
This is what I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
I don't think many people in my generation understand what communism is and how
Uh-huh.
it and just what it is. What does that
Okay.
even mean?
Okay.
And why it looks like it's attempting to trickle into our country. I wanted to touch on that, and then maybe get your thoughts on Candace Owens right now, and just
Okay.
what she's attempting to uncover. So I was just curious your thoughts on both of those things.
All right. We can do that. We'll give you the quick and dirty, history of communism as it relates to that, and we can do more detail.
Yeah.
But I can go ahead and give you books that are worth reading and stuff too. But here's the quick and dirty one. Communism in modern times was founded by Karl Marx, who was a Jew. That's important.
Okay.
Now, the problem was that Karl Marx was basically taught by people who hated their own race. That is the Jewish race. So as he got older, he was raised what they call Platonic philosophy from Plato, meaning that all of the world should be divided into three different classes, and the elites should be the very top that would be controlling the people down below. That's basically where he comes from. It goes from his father.
Right.
So as a guy that hated his own race, him and a friend named Ingalls, who was a very wealthy guy, they got together and started pulling out all the different philosophical ideas that trace all the way back to, say, the 1700s, 1600s. Part of that goes back, by the way, to the Order of the Illuminati. That's where that comes from with Adam Weishaupt. And that was when Weishaupt was a conspirator. He started this idea of hating religion because it was the religions of the world, the big ones, mostly Christianity and Judaism, that were preventing him from basically wanting to, control the world's wealth through the hands of a few. And since the religions of the world would be getting in his way, he had to figure out a way to destroy them. So basically, Karl Marx, 100 years later, and Frederick Engels, that was the guy that helped finance him, they took all of these ideas from him and some other ones too, Spartacus, going back to the Romans, and put this together. Again, making a long story short, into what is now known as communism, because they began to realize the only way they were going to implement this idea of basically world control is to destroy any resistance that got in the way and replace it with this movement that would be good for mankind. See, he was using the excuse of the workers of the world uniting, getting together and overthrowing the capitalist pigs. And so that was basically the premise to it. There's obviously a lot more to this than that. But that's the basic premise to it. The best book to read on this, of course, is The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Skousen, who was he was one of the top guys in the FBI for 16 years. He was in the administration end of it as well. He was also a field worker. Some of his friends went out and got Babyface Nelson during the days of like Al Capone during their day 1930s and stuff. And he also lived in LA for a long time, where they were routing out communists in Hollywood. Skousen was involved with that. He knew many very famous actors and actresses that were donating money. Then it was very vogue to donate money to communists. And he went in there and sat down with them and do you have any idea what you're supporting? And they didn't really know. And so So anyway, when he wrote The Naked Communist in the 1950s, it became a bestseller because people wanted to know the questions that you just asked.
Right.
Tell me the history of this. So there's that, and I recommend that to anybody who wants to know the basics of communism. Now, the big difference here, the big fight of communism that's going on in our country now, is what's the difference between communism and socialism. All right. Karl Marx differentiated those because socialism is government control of everything. Communism is the same, except communism implements that by violent revolution, by bloody violent revolution. And they do that by getting the workers of the world to unite, against the capitalists, and they overthrow them. So that's the basic premise of what communism is as a to the differences. Now, we have a lot of socialists who don't believe in the bloody revolution part, but do believe in the government control of everything, by the way, including you and me, because that's where it's going to lead to. So that's the basic premise. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, and I'm beginning to understand it more and more. From what I've heard, it sounds like communism ultimately doesn't work, and I don't know if you can expound on that, or maybe the dangers of communism and why it may appear to be good, but everything I'm researching looks like, it sounds good in theory, but it ultimately isn't. So
exactly, and let's go back and go through that then real fast. They've tried communist kinds of techniques and tactics in 22 civilizations that have been recorded in history. Every one of them tried some sort of socialism or communism. That is, government control of both the production and the means of a society functioning. And it would be at the very top by elites that would be the ones making the decisions. And then what's left over would be breadcrumbs thrown to the masses. But here's the catch that Marx was so brilliant at, okay? He painted communism as something that would be good for the workers. That's what made it so likable to guys on the street like you and I, is it looks like, well, you know what? I'm barely making it. If I had government that was there to take care of me, then I wouldn't have to worry about where where the next meal comes from or a roof over my head. Right. So he used that as the leverage to sell communism to the masses. That's the workers of the world uniting, that kind of thing. And of course, it was all a ruse, because when you look at it very closely, communism basically is the movement of the elites at the very top that want to use that as a means to destroy any competition against them, including the draconian measures of government to do that. So that's why these big corporations love socialism and communism, because it wipes out their competition. How do they do it? They start bribing congressmen to start passing bills that will make it more difficult for their competition, to have a business. A good example of this is the oil industry. The oil industry, as you know, is one of the biggest monopolies on the planet. So when the Rockefeller came along, he began to look at communism as a means as leverage, if you will, to destroy his competition. So he started financing senators and congressmen and that kind of thing. And before you knew it, he started creating what they call a cartel. And a cartel is a like-minded group of men and women who are going to conspiratorially, very quietly, without anybody knowing it, wipe out your competition so you can have a monopoly over whatever industry you decided to join. Well, in this case, it was oil. And that's where this whole idea of the carpetbaggers and all that came from back in the 1870s, just after the Civil War. Also, the Harriman family, they got involved with back then with the railroad business, and they did the same thing. They got in government, created the socialist legislation that would wipe out competition, and that's how they eventually took over controlling the industries of the railroads. And the third one was banking. Banking was the big one with J.P. Morgan. His dad used to be the right-hand man in one of the Rothschild families in Europe, and that's where J.P. Morgan, who was a son of him, that's where he got his training. So he came over here with a lot of the money, with mostly Rothschild money, and started his own bank fraternity. And again, I'll say it again, they did the same thing that his friend Rockefeller and his friend Harriman did. They started monopolizing the banking. And that's all, you can read all this in a book called Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. And especially on page 950, that's where the guy that wrote the book, Carol Quigley, talks about how that the whole so-called communist movement, which is not really a movement of the downtrodden masses, they want you to believe it is. It's actually a movement of the super rich using communist tactics, right? Karl Marx tactics to knock down or sweep away any of the competition that's out there. So, does that make sense?
That does make sense. So just to kind of reiterate, and I'll say it in the terms I kind of understand. Communism is a complete takeover of control of basically every asset of a country or economy. In return, they're telling the people, hey, we're essentially going to take care of you, but then eventually after they have the control, it takes away the freedom of the people in a sense.
Correct.
And that's interesting. Cool. I'm in the energy industry myself. I do solar and batteries, and it has been big oil, which has, they have control over everything. The power companies, as one of my mentors says, Taylor McCarthy says, it's the last standing monopoly. It still is monopoly, these electric companies. And what I do with giving power back to the people, essentially, I'm saying, hey, we're going to put solar and batteries in your home to give you control back. I'm going to lower your electric bill. You're not dependent on the grid system solely, and this will help power your home. It helps give you freedom again. And I think this all kind of plays in and ties into it. So
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And that's why they have been trying to monopolize now the solar industry. The red Chinese jumped in before the establishment oil company did, and basically they're trying to create that monopoly on that for the reasons that we've been talking about. It is about control. It really is. By the way, that goes for the big pharmaceutical companies. Most people don't know that big pharma, the majority of their products are oil based. Now think about that.
I didn't know that.
That's oil based, and of course, which oil comes from the ground. Now, the big cartels that was set up with big pharma was done back in the 1920s. It was the Rockefeller family, their group with a guy named Alan Dulles that came in. They set up that, and they made all these cartel agreements with the German groups like Bayer, Aspirin, and all that, knowing that they were going to need oil in order to make their products, and so they created a cartel. And Rockefeller then got into the, quote, cancer industry and the medical industry and all that kind of stuff. That happened in 1901 to 1920. There's a great book about this. It's volume 2 of a 2-volume series called World Without Cancer by G. Edward Griffin. And the first volume is basically the science of cancer research, and the second volume is the politics of cancer research, and that's where it gets into that monopoly, the pharmaceuticals, that kind of stuff. It'll blow your mind to read the book. It came out, by the way, in the early 1970s. I knew it, and when he wrote them, and I handed out hundreds of copies of them because it really did talk about the monopoly that we're talking about here. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is all good information, and I know there's a lot more to it. But this is perfect. That's kind of what I wanted, was a basic understanding of it. And I guess I was going to say, what do we need to look out for in our day? And it sounds like something, if you're for freedom, you should probably be fighting against communism.
Everything we got for communism, socialism, or Nazism. Let me give you the definitions of the three. Nazism literally means national socialism. That literally what it means. So there's no difference other than the fact that Nazis began their takeovers of government to turn them into socialists at a national level. That's what it means, national socialism. So there's no difference, okay, other than the fact that who's going to be running the show. International socialism is, by definition, communism. That's literally an international, it's the same thing, except the international communists want to have a global socialist world government. All right. That's the difference. So there's really no difference other than the fact that they're both going to accomplish the same thing. Now, remember, there are many socialist organizations that clash with each other because they're concerned about who's going to run the show. And this happens a lot, especially in Africa, where the communist Marxists down there are constantly fighting against each other about who's going to control the government. That's why there's so much blood and bloodshed down there, because it's about power. And that's what it's about. Well, that's what happened in 1917 when Stalin was brought in. He was financed, by the way, by not only the Rockefeller family, but also several other large international banking corporations out of Europe and Paris and London mostly, to be able to have that happen. And it worked. Why would Rockefeller finance Lenin, a communist who is diametrically opposed, supposedly, to everything that Rockefeller stands for? It's because when Lenin took over, the first thing they did was to give these big corporations and banks the oil and gas concessions. Are you following me now? Of all of Russia. Well, they had a built-in monopoly, and that's what literally what happened. Averill Harriman was the guy that was the front man for all of that. He was the one that ran his dad was the railroad guy I told you about earlier. Well, Averill Harriman was the guy. That was the man that put together the manganese, which is the chemicals used to produce steel. They had several huge manganese complexes there in Russia, Leningrad, that kind of area. And guess who wound up controlling them? The Harriman family, along with the Rockefellers, and they financed it. So they didn't have to worry about competition. Nobody was going to start a business. Why? Because the government stomped out any competition potential. This is why the super rich love socialism. This is why you're seeing people like George Soros and these very wealthy billionaires that are so bent on creating a communist revolution, because they know the end result, if they're successful, will be that the government will wind up stomping out anybody that threatens their livelihood. In this case, monopolies is what it's going to be. So that's why. Now, understand, not all rich people are social or communists. I'm not saying that, but I am saying there are very select, very high places. Some of the richest people in the world have been financing the world revolutionary movement since the 1890s. And it really started around, I want to say 1910, 1912, when they started financing what turned out to be the Nazi Party in Germany. Now, why would they do that with Hitler? Well, Hitler basically, he already had several monopolies that were already there. They financed him to monopolize the rest of Germany, which at that time was one of the biggest economies in all of Europe, that include the steel industry and that kind of thing. Well, where did the money come from to do all that? It came from the Chase Manhattan Bank, Rockefeller's bank. And this is heavily documented in Anthony C. Sutton's writings, if you want to read any of this. But that's where that came from. Well, again, why would they do that? Because they wanted to create a monopoly under socialism. Again, I repeat, communism and socialism, the idea of it being a movement of the downtrodden masses, is a total and complete lie. In fact, I'm going to go and say this. The biggest lie of modern times in the 20th century is that the radical left movement, right, is to distribute the wealth for the wealthy. Little do those people know on the street that are doing this, that they're being financed by the very people they hate. And that's the biggest lie, in my opinion, in the 20th and 21st century.
Wow. These are all very interesting, and I like that you said it's all documented, and I'm going to go study that out even a little bit more, but this is super eye-opening for me, and I didn't even know where the word Nazi came from until now. National
Socialism. That's literally translation. Now, again, I'll say it again. National Socialism, the Nazis believe in starting the implementation of a given targeted nation,
right,
only for that nation. The global socialist movement are the communists out of Moscow, and also the ones I mentioned out of New York and London. They want a globalist world socialist movement. And of course, they control the rioting and revolution. Where does the money come from? A lot of these groups, Antifa being a perfect example of that. Yeah. This is what our Cash Patel is now doing, is they're tracing the money along. A lot of it's coming out of Germany, but these are big corporations financing these communist revolutionaries that you're seeing.
That's interesting. I think for me, what's interesting too is now I'm starting to grasp all of this, and when I do, I'm like, oh, that's eye-opening, and I'm starting to understand that. But there's big words that are thrown around the media all the time that I'm now starting to understand, like socialism, communism, When people throw out the words fascism, Nazi, all these things, like those are all words that I'm really not too familiar with. But now I am. I'm starting to get more familiar with. But when those terms are being thrown out there, my point is, I think the majority of people my age do not understand them. They're just using them because they hear them in other places. And so they start throwing out the word like Nazi, fascist, this, that, without even knowing what it means.
Now let me just give a caveat to that. Very good, by the way, very good points. My emails are showing that a lot of young people are writing me and asking me these very questions, and here's what I respond to them. How if the media has been calling Donald Trump a fascist, all right? Now here's the lie there, okay? Fascists, the first thing fascists do is they increase the size of government. They absolutely, why would they do that? Because fascists use the government for their control. That's what fascists do. That's what communists do, the same thing. So let me ask you this. I always ask this, show me where Donald Trump has increased the size of government. Anybody want to raise their hand on that one? He's done everything in the opposite. He's doing everything to shrink it. As a matter of fact, as of today, I understand there's been like 200,000 or 300,000 bureaucrats that have been quitting the government. He's firing a lot of them. That's not what a fascist does. That is why this is a lie to call him an autocrat. Autocrat is one who uses the government for his own purposes. He's the opposite of that. And that's what most people don't get. If they make the accusation of being a fascist, the first thing you ask is he increasing the size of government? And of course he's not. That's a lie. So that's kind of the frame of reference that you need to come from as it relates to defining just what a fascist is. Now, Mussolini was a fascist, and in his case, what he did, this is during the same time of Hitler, he used what they call corporate fascism. And what he did was he made deals with people like that own Fiat and these big corporations in Italy to make a deal that he would help stomp out their competition in Italy if they agreed to get him in power. And so they did. They put him in power, and he did exactly what he said he was going to do. He started stomping out, that is, passing legislation that would help destroy or at least monopolize these big corporations, and they would have more power. And by the way, that's what Roosevelt did when he took over here in the 1930s, and that's a whole other subject. But that's really how this works. Again, if they're going to call you a fascist, ask the question: is the guy you're calling a fascist increasing the size of government as fascists do, or is he shrinking it? That's the big question.
And fascism, my understanding, just means like total control, right?
Well, yeah, it's the exact same definition of what a communist is. The only difference of fascism is on a national level, communism is on an international level. That's the only difference.
And national meaning like within the United States, and then international is like worldwide. Right.
Exactly. Okay. Yes, correct.
Gotcha. I love defining this because I think this is going to help educate everybody. And then I would then suggest to go say, hey, go list out these terms, which I want to go do, and define them. So when you hear them thrown around, you can be educated on what it actually means. And then
let me throw this one more caveat out too in regard to documenting it. You want to get, as I said, get The Naked Communists by W. Clement Skousen. That's definitely a must. It was written as a textbook. It's very well done. And get the one that his son did, who is a professor. His son wrote a book called The Naked Socialist, which gives you the entire history, starting all the way back 3,000 years, of the 22 civilizations recorded in history that tried socialism, and it failed. They all collapsed under their own weight. That's called The Naked Socialist. I recommend that to everybody if you want to learn what we're talking about.
The Naked Socialist.
Yeah, by Paul Skousen.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm going to give you one more before we go. I know this is important. In order to know who finances the world revolutionary movement that I've been discussing, you want to read Cleon Skousen's The Naked Capitalist. That came out about 10, 12 years after The Naked Communist did. That documents how the global banking fraternity that I mentioned, the Rockefellers, the Harrimans, they're the ones that financed the world revolution movement and how they did it. They did it through their major foundations they control, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Rockefeller's Straight Fund, plus the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie International, all those different funds, foundations were the ones that financed many of these world revolutionary movements. And again, they did it because they want to use government to destroy their competition. That's how they do it. So that book talk is called The Naked Capitalist. Now, these are not capitalists in the laissez-faire that you and I are familiar with. You mentioned your job, you're going out. You're a capitalist. That's great, by the way. Advertise that, wear a t-shirt with it. These guys were not capitalists. They wanted you to believe they were, okay? That is the Rockefellers and stuff. But they're actually closet socialists. They want big government programs. And by the way, all of their foundation papers, and I've read them all, I'm the old Mr. Research, they have never, that I could find, maybe once out of every 100, do they even mention capitalism. They always talk about using government as the way to solve the world problem.
Interesting.
Yep.
This is such a good foundational just place to have knowledge, because this is the foundation. This is, when I talked about our last podcast, the iceberg of getting down deep and understanding how the world works, to then go see what the media is doing, what everybody's doing, politics on both sides. And when you have an understanding of this, you can see the politics in a better light, and the media and the news, and what they're pushing and why they're pushing it. And it's making it a lot more apparent as like, okay, what side is leading to what? What side is leading to actual freedom? What side is leading to actual bondage? And that's why I wanted to understand the definition of communism. And I'm going to dive in a little deeper for myself and go read these books. The National Capitalist, is that what it was called, by Cleon Skousen?
No, the Naked Capitalist and the Naked Communist. Those are the two.
Naked Capitalist.
Start out with Naked Communist first. That was the one that came out in the 50s, and I highly recommend it. Became a bestseller. Paul Harvey loved that book. And then later, when he heard that there was a lot of people that were financing the actual revolutionary movement that he exposed in that first book, he wanted to find out and document that. And later, when he did, basically, The Naked Capitalist is a review and commentary of a much larger book called Tragedy and Hope. And that book is the one that exposed really what is the best kept secret of the 20th century. And that is that the world revolutionary movement, the communist movement, is not a movement of the downtrodden masses, but is actually a movement of the dynastic super rich. And that's what The Naked Capitalist is about. And that's not a very long book. It's just a review and a commentary, about 130 pages. I cannot recommend that enough to you, because when you read that, it shows how these, we call them the big boys or the insiders, how they took over both political parties from the very top. So up to most people did not know this until Skousen came out with this book. And by the way, they admit this. He quotes their papers and their records and stuff. They admit that they took basically over the political parties. Now at the very top, not at the grassroots level, not you and I, but I'm talking at the very top. So that's where this idea of a rhino came from, a rhino Republican. Yeah. They basically were going along with this immense pressure, which is beginning to be felt by all humanity, the socialist pressure. And it's funny that the Republicans at the top were the ones that were pushing some of the big government ideas that they supposedly, as a conservative, were not supposed to be pushing. And nobody could figure out why. Well, when you read The Naked Capitalist, you'll have your answer. So what happened is, and I'll make this quick, when Reagan came along first, right, he was running against the platform, against these people. And he won. He won, and I was involved with that quite a bit back in the 70s. That was where the moral majority came in, and he won. And they didn't know what to do. They were shocked that Reagan won by such a landslide, because every single candidate, with the exception, I think, there's one going all the way back to the early 1900s, was a member of the entourage of this group. They were beholden to them anyway, including, by the way, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon broke off from them, but he was too. Well, when Reagan came along, he ran against them. The only problem is some of the people that he put in his cabinet we're still part of this group. And there's a lot of books about this, and we can get into that another time. Yeah. Well, then when Trump came along, he sincerely ran on a real platform against this. This is called the populist movement, which is a movement to do it against governments. You shrink government and get back to freedom of the Constitution as originally intended by the founding fathers. The big boys that I'm talking about, the naked capitalists, they hate the Constitution. They hate it because it distributes the power amongst the people. They want to monopolize it. That's the big difference. That's why they hate the Constitution. And that's why they've been spending now literally billions and billions of dollars to educate your generation not to appreciate or respect the Constitution.
Right.
That's what they've done. And that's why we have so many young people out there that are so confused. They don't get what's going on.
Yeah.
Well, now you're getting a basic picture of it. And that's the reason.
Well, I think that even goes back to, we'll just mention Charlie Kirk for a minute, him going to campuses. And he would say, look, I can unravel 4 years of indoctrination in 3 hours. And that's why they're so scared of me, with one question, one truth claim, one something else. And what he did was he showed people a way to think outside of what they're being indoctrinated in. And that's where even James 1:5 in the Bible says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. But it also goes back to go study it out for yourself. Study it, read the words, look into different texts. And it's interesting, I'm starting to read other things where even in past civilizations, one of the things they do to ruin the society is burn the texts, get rid of the documentation. I remember reading the book Fahrenheit 451, where it's all about burning the books. That's what the firemen do. They burn all the books. They burn all the knowledge. And then there's a people out in the woods who have it all memorized. And they're the ones that are going to rewrite all the books and keep it. And what a great book that is. And it makes so much sense to me now. Whereas when I read that book in junior high, I'm like, what does this even mean? But now I'm like, well, you need the history books and the correct ones to have correct knowledge. And here we are. Let me ask you this. What does a society look like once it is a communistic society? Like, let's say America became communist. Like, what would that look like?
That's easy to answer. Russia before the fall of the Iron Curtain, and now Red China. That's what's going to happen. They're going to get to the point where they're going to, quote, control you, including everything you read, everything you watch, and all the food's going to be controlled by them. They're monopolizing the world's wealth in the hands of a few. Now, there's competition at the very top of this group. It's not that everybody's cooperating exactly. You're going to find there's going to be some guys who want more power and faster than the other guys do. But right now, it'll look like what it was in Russia for that 70 years, from 1917 all the way till the fall of the Iron Curtain. And now the old KGB, the old Soviet secret police, is trying their best now to resurrect what at one time was the old communist regime. That's what's going on with Putin right now. He wants to get back, the oligarchs that he's with want to get back to the old school, if you will. The problem is this: the young people there have tasted capitalism. They have nice phones. They drive nice cars. They know what capitalism's like, and they're not going to want it. So there's going to be some kind of a revolution, which I believe what is going to be starting this week, by the way. There's going to be some kind of I think they're going to start seeing some things going on here in America that are going to start waking up a lot of people, but that's just me. Yeah. According to the cycle stuff.
Right.
We're heading into this now. But going back to your question, they want to change it into what they have in China, and they want to expand that. The reason why is China is the ultimate monopoly. They control everything there. And there is no competition in China unless they allow it. And that's how it works. They're the ones that are the gods of their own nation. And of course, the Lao Zhenjing, which is the groups of people like you and I that want to overthrow them, and there are like 400 million of them. I think you're going to see a revolution there. I don't know when, but it'll be soon in regard to that. I understand that Xi, the guy that runs China, is having some health issues and other things. So, but that's what they want. They want to have a world government where all the world's monopoly of the wealth is controlled in the hands of a few. And by the way, the United Nations is the framework of which they're using for that world government. I always remind people when I say that, people forget this one thing. Who donated the land for the United Nations building? It was the Rockefeller family. What does that tell you?
Where the money came from, that they wanted control.
And they use the UN as the framework for this world government that they're trying to create. The bad news for them was that this populist movement now that has taken hold over the last 10 years, they started with the Tea Party and the other things, that now is now going into a course that they can't control it. So what do they start doing? Ask Charlie Kirk.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. For those that don't know, what does the United Nations consist of?
The United Nations was founded by a guy named Alger Hiss back in 1945. Just so you'll know, they had tried this before, tried a foundation for creating the framework for world government back at the League of Nations back in the 1920s. And it was going to be here in America. And it was started, by the way, the people that were pushing it was the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And so it was also the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Now, Andrew Carnegie was the steel monopoly guy. Rockefeller was the oil monopoly guy. See where I'm going with this? Yep. Harriman was the railroad monopoly guy. And now the banking was the JP Morgan Group. Well, they all got together and they created a organization called the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. That was started in 1921, and they used those. They brought all these quote foreign policy experts, that's in quotes, into New York at the old Harold Platt building down there in I think it's on 50th Avenue, and that's where the, if you will, the semi-secret club that they were going to use to start pushing this idea of a global government. And the League of Nations sprang out of that group. They wrote a white paper and all that stuff that studied this. So they tried to start a League of Nations, and they went to Europe to make sure the Europeans were on board with it. That is, European leaders that were in the back pocket of the big banks and stuff. After that was done, they came back here and they tried to ram that through Congress. First, then it went to the Senate. The Senate was supposed to ratify that. All right, now get this. They did it 2 days before Christmas. All right. And it didn't go through. And you know why? Because the ones that read the bill said that if we do this, we're basically surrendering our sovereignty over to a global government. That's basically what it would have done. And so it failed. Well, okay, that failed. That was after World War One. Then World War II came along, and don't get me started about World War II. I can show to you that we were maneuvered into World War II. That with the whole Pearl Harbor thing, with what happened in China. I mean, with what happened in Europe. We were maneuvered into that, and that's a long story. I don't get into it here. But after the end of the war, they had already had the framework set up for what became the United Nations. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The guy that wrote the charter to the UN later was identified as a communist agent. I kid you not. His name is Alger Hiss, Hiss, and he was out of San Francisco. He was a Soviet agent. And the other 16 people that signed the UN Charter were later identified as communists. The only one that was not a communist, there were 17 of that signed it, was a government guy, Dean Acheson. I think it was Dean Acheson. He was a member of the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations out of New York. See where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
So that's what happened with the UN. The UN then they needed the land for donations. So for Rockefeller family, hey, we got a piece of property there near Manhattan. We'll build it there. So that's how that all happened. Well, the idea was to use the UN as a sort of a framework that would be, quote, that this is their quote, man's last hope for peace. And that was their jargon they used. Well, with the advent of the atomic weapons that happened, just after all that was going on with Japan and Hiroshima and all that stuff, they knew now they could use that as leverage to literally frighten the world into accepting the UN as man's last hope for peace. Otherwise, we're going to have a nuclear war, don't you know? And that's what they did. Now, it failed, just so you'll know. In fact, there has been more wars. This is an absolute documented fact. There's been more wars since the founding of the United Nations in the last 70, 75 years than there has been in the last 300.
Oh, wow.
That is an absolute fact. So the United Nations isn't going to give anybody peace. Now, they built it on a socialist framework, by the way, that they built it on, not on a free enterprise, not on a constitutional framework, not on a Bill of Rights, not on any of that. They built it. The actual charter written by a communist was patterned after the communist Moscow charter they used. They patterned it after that.
Gotcha.
And you can read about all this in several books. There's one by a guy named Lee. He wrote a book called The United Nations Conspiracy. And then that guy, Ed Griffin, I mentioned earlier on the cancer one, he wrote a book called The Fearful Master, a second look at the UN. That one you should read. That is a bombshell. And he gets into this stuff in great detail and all that. So,
well, this is all really good information. Got an appointment I need to run to, but I did want to get your thoughts on what Candace Owen is doing right now. I don't know if you've been following her and just how her feelings on Charlie Kirk and where she's going.
there's some bitterness there that I'm reading into that. I understand she was not invited to be one of the keynotes at the funeral. The problem is this: when she got into this whole Israel Jewish thing, I'm not calling her anti-Semitic. That'd be wrong. But I do think that she's leaning in a lot of things and believing of the so-called Jewish conspiracy stuff. And there is no Jewish conspiracy. I wrote a book on this, and it's just not true. A lot of the just so you know, a lot of the communist movements have been trying to blame a lot of the world's problems on Jewish, not because it's true, but because they're trying to focus our attention away from those guys out of Moscow and New York and London. So they have what they call a straw dog. They create this image of this whole thing being, and a lot of people have bought into that. She's been reading, like I say, this guy Shlomo's book on the Khazars and stuff. And we can get into the details someday, but that's what's going on there. And I'm feeling, and I'm not blaming her for anything here, right, but I am feeling that she's feeling a little bit slighted. And because, she was the one that worked with Charlie at the beginning of the turning point. And now, she's not going to be speaking, I guess. I'm just reading on between the lines of some of the emails I'm getting and stuff.
Right.
So now, as far as her philosophical stuff, we'll get into that later, what she's feeling with the Israel thing. We haven't talked about Israel. We'll do that maybe the next time.
Yeah, that would be good. Well, that's good. I think this is perfect. Ton of good information. I can't wait to keep diving into this as we just uncover more and more truth. That's what I love about it. So,
well, we really hope so, and we really hope that we can footnote everything. They used to call me Mr. Footnote. That was kind of an epitaph. Yeah. But I only say that because of the amount of research we've done, and I used to have teams, and my files and all. We want to show that education that you're getting is not using this truth you're talking about. They're not using the documentation that's available if you just know where to look. And that's what we're trying to do here, is to pass the word on where this all goes. So
I love that. Well, I know it's fun. It's fun for me to listen to you, and you're able to just rattle this off and you just know it. It's
rattle. Sometimes the operative word for the old man,
Well, it's so good. Well, I always appreciate you taking the time, and I'm excited to, keep sending these good messages out to the world. So
very good. Well, listen, if anybody want to ask any questions, my email is rmf 0007 at Gmail. rmf 00007 at Gmail. 4 zeros and a 7. Okay. That's my email for any questions you might want to ask.
rmf 0007 at gmail.
Gmail.com.
Mm-hmm. Not 007. Quadruple 07.
No, I'm not. Yeah. James Bond, I'm not. Believe me, James Bond, I'm not.
I love that. Also, when we post to this social media, I'll be posting mostly to X, maybe to others, YouTube, maybe even try TikTok again. I don't know. But that being said, with people having questions, go ahead and comment in the comment section, and questions and anything else you have to say. So
very good.
Well, right on. Well, thank you so much for jumping on, and I'm sure we'll be doing more of these soon. So
always available. Glad to help.
Okay, thanks, Rick. We'll see you.
You got it.
Bye.